October 2020. The world was a mess. Isolation had become the new normal, and fear felt as constant as the air we breathed. For weeks, I'd been glued to the news, consumed by the endless flood of bad headlines. By the time I decided to escape, I was desperate to be anywhere but home. Joshua Tree National Park seemed like the perfect place. A vast, open desert where I could be completely alone. Or so I thought. I drove out in my RV late one afternoon, chasing the setting sun as it painted the horizon in shades of crimson and gold. The dusty trail leading to my campsite was a rough, twisting road, barely visible in the growing darkness. I parked miles away from the main campground, deliberately seeking isolation. Out here, there was nothing but the whispering wind and the gnarled silhouettes of Joshua trees clawing at the sky. The first night passed quietly. I spent it sipping whiskey under a blanket of stars, marveling at the sheer emptiness of it all. The silence wasn't peaceful, though. It pressed against my ears, heavy and suffocating, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. The second night, everything changed. It began just after midnight. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard the first knock. It wasn't at the door. It was at the window. 3 slow, deliberate taps, spaced out like punctuation marks. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I lay there, frozen. My heart began to pound, the sound echoing in my ears. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind had blown a branch against the glass, or an animal had wandered too close. But as I reached for the flashlight beside my bed, a second knock followed. 3 more taps, this time louder. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the cold floor sending a jolt through me. My hands fumbled with the flashlight, and when I finally clicked it on, the beam cut through the dark interior of the RV like a knife. The knocking had come from the small side window near the kitchenette. Slowly, I crept toward it, the flashlight trembling in my grip. The glass was fogged from the inside, but I could see the faint outline of a hand pressed against it. No, not a hand. It was gloved, with fingers too long to be human. The palm was pressed flat against the glass, and just as I registered its shape, it pulled away, leaving behind a smudge that glistened in the moonlight. I staggered back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. Who the hell was out here? Who's there? I shouted, the words scraping my throat. There was no answer. The silence outside was deafening, so absolute that it made my ears ache. I waited listening, my body tense and trembling. Then I heard it. Footsteps crunching in the dirt, circling the RV. I followed the sound, moving to the opposite side of the vehicle. My flashlight beam swept the window, illuminating nothing but my own reflection. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, I thought whoever it was had left. And then came the knock, this time at the door. It wasn't frantic or aggressive. It was measured, deliberate, the kind of knock you'd expect from someone trying to sell you something. But out here, in the middle of the desert, it was wrong. I moved toward the door, knife in hand, every instinct screaming at me to stay quiet. My fingers hovered over the lock, and I leaned in to peer through the peephole. What I saw made my stomach lurch. A figure stood just beyond the steps, tall and impossibly thin. They wore a mask, something old and cracked, the kind you might find in a forgotten antique store. The face was grotesque. Its hollow eyes stared back at me, and the painted-on smile stretched unnaturally wide, as if mocking me. The figure didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stood there, perfectly still, as though they had all the time in the world. I stepped back from the door, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this some deranged local? A camper pulling a sick prank? But how would they even know I was here? I hadn't seen another soul for miles, and then they knocked again. This time, the sound was harder, louder, as if they were testing the strength of the door. "Go away!" I yelled, gripping the knife so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The figure tilted their head, the motion slow and deliberate, as if they were studying me through the door. Then, without warning, they They turned and walked away, their silhouettes swallowed by the darkness. I stood there, rooted to the spot, knife in one hand and flashlight in the other. My breathing was ragged, my mind unable to process what had just happened. I wanted to believe it was over, that whoever, or whatever it was, had left. But deep down, I knew better. The handprint on the window was still there, and when I looked closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The fingers weren't just long. They were clawed. The figure was standing at the edge of the campsite, just beyond the reach of my headlights. The mask was unmistakable, its grotesque features glinting faintly in the pale light. They stood motionless, like a statue, their head tilted slightly to one side. I turned the headlights on, flooding the desert with harsh white light. The figure didn't flinch. They didn't even move. It was as if the light didn't affect them at all. "Get out of here!" I shouted, my voice cracking. Still, they stood there, silent and unmoving. My hand hovered over the ignition, the thought of driving away taking root in my mind. But I hesitated. The terrain was rough, and I wasn't confident I could navigate it in the dark without risking a breakdown. The figure tilted their head again, the motion almost curious. Then, slowly, they raised one hand and pointed at me. My blood turned to ice. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed by that accusing gesture. Minutes, maybe hours. Eventually, I mustered the courage to reach for the horn, the blaring sound shattering the silence. The figure didn't react. They just vanished. One moment, they were there, and the next they were gone. No retreating footsteps, no shadows moving in the periphery. It was as if they'd been swallowed by the desert itself. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the knife so tightly that my hand ached. The silence outside was deafening, broken only by the occasional gust of wind. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I was a wreck. But daylight didn't bring relief. It brought something worse. When I finally stepped out of the RV to inspect the campsite, I found footprints. Hundreds of them, circling the vehicle in a chaotic pattern. They weren't ordinary footprints, either. They were too deep, as if the figure had been unnaturally heavy, and the shape was wrong. Elongated, with clawed toes that dug into the dirt, I followed the trail a few feet into the desert before it stopped abruptly, as if whoever or whatever had made them had simply disappeared. I couldn't stay. I packed up the RV as quickly as I could, my hands shaking the entire time. The drive back to civilization felt endless, every shadow along the road a potential threat. But the terror wasn't over. That night, in the safety of my apartment, I heard it again. 3 knocks. They came from the window, soft but deliberate. My heart stopped as I turned to look, but there was no one there. Just the same smudge, a faint handprint, clawed fingers trailing down the glass. The police didn't believe me when I called. They chalked it up to stress. Maybe a prank. But I knew the truth. Whatever I'd encountered in the desert hadn't stayed there. And now, it was here. The following morning, the first rays of sunlight flooded the desert, bathing everything in a warm, golden glow that felt jarringly out of place after the events of the night. My body ached from the tension, my mind fogged by exhaustion, but the evidence was there. Those clawed footprints circled the RV like some macabre dance. I needed answers. Joshua Tree National Park is vast, but there's a ranger station not too far from the main entrance. I decided to head there, certain that even if I sounded like a lunatic, someone might know about local legends, maybe even other incidents like mine. The drive was nerve-wracking. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the masked figure in the distance, pursuing me. But the desert remained still, as if it had erased all traces of the previous night. When I reached the ranger station, I stumbled inside, desperate to find anyone who could help. The young ranger behind the desk looked up from his paperwork, startled by my disheveled appearance. "You okay?" he asked, concern etched into his expression. "No, I'm not okay," I said, my voice trembling. Something Someone was outside my RV last night. They knocked on my windows, circled my campsite. They were wearing a mask, and there are footprints, clawed footprints outside my RV. I realized how absurd I sounded, but the ranger didn't laugh or dismiss me. Instead, his face darkened. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Where were you camped?" I told him, and his expression grew more serious. "That's pretty remote. We don't patrol out there much. Have you heard of anything like this before?" I pressed. He hesitated. "Not recently, but there are stories." "What stories?" He leaned back, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "There's a local legend about a man who used to live out in the desert decades ago. He was a recluse, built a shack out there somewhere. They say he was obsessed with masks, collected them, made them. People in town thought he was harmless until hikers started going missing near his property. When the authorities finally went out there, the shack was empty, abandoned. They never found him, just a bunch of masks hanging on the walls. A chill ran down my spine. "And you think it's him?" "I don't know," he said, his tone cautious. "But every so often, people report strange encounters. A masked figure, knocking on their windows, asking for help. Usually, it's campers who've gone too far off the beaten path." "What happens to them?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Most of them leave and never come back," he said. "But there are a few." He trailed off, his meaning clear. The ranger offered to accompany me back to my campsite, but I refused. I wanted to put as much distance between myself and Joshua Tree as possible. I drove home, trying to convince myself that it was over, that the desert would keep its secrets. But it didn't. A few nights later, I was jolted awake by the sound of knocking. I bolted upright in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't coming from the front door. It was at the window. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it at the glass. For a moment I thought I saw something, a handprint, smeared and clawed. But when I blinked, it was gone. I called the ranger the next day, desperate for reassurance. He sounded calm, almost detached. "Sometimes," he said, "when you've seen something like that, it doesn't let you go so easily." I never went back to Joshua Tree after that. I sold the RV, moved to a new apartment, and tried to rebuild my life. But every now and then, I hear it again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. And I know he's still out there, waiting. It was early April 2023 when I decided to take a trip to Ruby Valley Campground in Nevada. I had heard it was a quiet, scenic place, a stretch of raw, untamed beauty nestled between the Ruby Mountains and the Humboldt Range. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was how deeply this trip would alter the very fabric of my understanding of reality. I pulled into the campground late in the afternoon, the sun slipping lazily behind jagged peaks. Shadows stretched long and crooked across the dusty ground. The air had a peculiar stillness, the kind that makes you glance over your shoulder, half expecting someone or something to be there. The campground wasn't crowded, just a couple of RVs scattered here and there. I parked my car near a picnic table that stood under a massive juniper tree, its gnarled branches twisting skyward like skeletal fingers. The table looked off. Its weathered surface was splintered and warped as if it had been sitting there for decades, enduring years of storms, sun, and snow. But it wasn't the age of the table that unsettled me. It was the way the shadows pooled around it, deeper and darker than they had any right to be. The dying sunlight touched everything else around me. Trees, rocks, even my car. But the table seemed untouched by it, as though it existed in a pocket of perpetual twilight. I brushed off the unease, convincing myself I was just tired from the drive. I set up my tent nearby and decided to eat dinner at the picnic table. As I sat there, the air grew colder, unnaturally so, and I noticed something strange. No birds chirped, no crickets sang. The silence pressed against me like a weight, filling my ears with the sound of my own breathing. Then, I saw it. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, But as I squinted into the growing darkness, I realized there was a figure sitting at the far end of the table. It was barely more than a shadow, an outline of something vaguely human. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. I stood up, my legs shaky, and took a cautious step toward it. The closer I got, the more wrong it felt. Its edges were blurry, indistinct, as though it wasn't fully there. And yet, I could feel its presence, an oppressive, suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. "Are you okay?" I tried again. No response. I took another step closer, and that's when it moved. Not in the way a person shifts or turns, but in a way that defied explanation. One moment it was sitting at the table, the next it was standing beside me. I stumbled back, my stomach twisting with fear. The figure had no face, no features. Just an empty void where a face should be. It radiated a cold so intense it burned, like standing in the heart of a glacier. I don't remember running to my car, but the next thing I knew, I was inside with the doors locked, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The figure was gone, or so I thought. When I glanced at the picnic table, it was there again, sitting as still as a statue. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I sat in my car, watching the shadow figure, my mind racing with every possible explanation. A hallucination? A prank? Some twisted product of my overactive imagination? But deep down, I knew it wasn't any of those things. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I dared to step out of the car. The shadow figure was gone, leaving the picnic table looking ordinary again. But the air still felt heavy, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, desperate to leave. As I folded my tent, I noticed something etched into the wood of the picnic table. At first, it looked like random scratches, but as I stared at it, the marks formed words. "It sees you." My blood turned to ice. I drove away from Ruby Valley Campground that morning, swearing never to return. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that I am being watched. At night, in the quiet of my apartment, I sometimes catch a glimpse of a shadow in the corner of my eye. When I turn to look, there's nothing there. But I know better now. It's still with me. I hadn't planned to stop at Baker's Hole that evening. It was supposed to be just another long stretch of highway, a casual drive through Montana's sweeping landscapes. But the storm rolled in faster than I expected, and the thought of navigating those winding roads under torrential rain was exactly appealing. Baker's Hole was a name I'd heard before a quiet campground nestled along the Madison River. Seemed harmless enough, the campground was almost deserted, save for a few scattered RVs that looked like they hadn't moved in months. Mine was the only vehicle that arrived that night. I backed into a spot near the tree line, the dense pines swaying ominously in the wind. As I killed the engine, the world around me went silent. It wasn't the comforting kind of silence you might expect in a forest. It was a suffocating, heavy quiet, the kind that feels wrong. Like the woods were holding their breath. I set up quickly, the rain already pelting the roof of the RV. Inside, it was cramped but cozy enough. The radio was still playing faintly from earlier soft static interrupted by bursts of some old country song. I turned the dial, searching for a station. But all I got was static. No music, no news, nothing but that grating, whispering hiss. As I fiddled with the dial, something caught my ear. It wasn't the static. It was underneath it, faint, almost imperceptible. Voices. The accident the river took them. I froze, hand hovering over the dial. The words were distorted, crackling like they were fighting to break through the static. I leaned in, pressing my ear closer to the speaker. All of them gone. The voice wasn't clear, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I turned the dial again, hoping to catch a station, any station. But the voices persisted, their words fractured and disjointed. Don't, stay, it's not safe. My chest tightened. I told myself it was interference, maybe some weird trick of the storm. But deep down I knew better. Something about those voices felt off. I tried to shake it off, turning the radio off entirely. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I could still hear the faint hum of static, almost like it had seeped into the air around me. I busied myself with dinner, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at the edges of my mind. The storm outside grew fiercer, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Every so often, I thought I heard something outside, footsteps crunching through the wet gravel, a faint tap against the RV's window. I told myself it was the wind, but I avoided looking too closely. It was around midnight when I decided to turn in. The rain had slowed, but the storm's presence lingered, heavy and oppressive. I climbed into the narrow bed at the back of the RV, pulling the blanket up to my chin. Sleep didn't come easily. I woke to the sound of static. At first, I thought I'd left the radio on, but I hadn't. The static was coming from somewhere else, deeper, like it was resonating through the walls of the RV. I sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. And then I heard it. He's awake. The voice was low and guttural, almost drowned out by the static. But I heard it, clear as day. Don't let him leave. I scrambled to my feet, flipping on every light in the RV. The static grew louder, a deafening roar that seemed to fill the entire space. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air thick and suffocating. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The static stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. My ears rang with the absence of sound, my pulse thundering in my chest. I stood there, frozen, every instinct screaming at me to run. And then I heard the knock. It was faint, almost polite. A soft tap, tap, tap against the RV door. My breath hitched. No one should have been out there. The campground was empty. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I stepped closer, my hands shaking as I reached for the curtain covering the small window on the door. Slowly, I pulled it back. There was nothing there. The knock came again. But it wasn't from the door anymore. It was from the window beside me. I turned, the blood draining from my face. The window was fogged up, rainwater streaking down the glass. But there was something else, a handprint, smeared and wet, slowly sliding down the pane. I stumbled back, my legs giving out beneath me. The lights in the RV flickered, and the static returned, louder than ever. "Leave now." The voice was right in my ear, as if someone were standing behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The air was electric, heavy with something I couldn't explain. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the driver's seat, not caring that I was still in my pajamas. The engine roared to life, and I threw the RV into gear, tires skidding on the wet gravel as I sped out of the campground. The static followed me. Even as I hit the highway, the faint hum of those voices lingered, weaving in and out of the crackling noise on the radio. I turned it off, but the static didn't stop. It was inside the RV now, inside me. You can't outrun it. The voice was faint, but it was there, just beneath the static. I drove for hours, not stopping until the sun broke over the horizon. By the time I pulled into a gas station, I was shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. The attendant gave me a strange look as I stumbled inside, muttering something about looking like I had seen a ghost. I didn't correct him. To this day, I don't know what I experienced at Baker's Hole. I've tried to rationalize it, blame it on the storm, or my overactive imagination. But deep down, I know the truth. Something was there that night. Something that wasn't human. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the static hums through the air, I swear I can still hear those voices. He's listening.